Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are located. My name is Diego Solana. I'm an international advisor of the World Jurist Association. This organization is an NGO based in Washington with a consultative status with the United Nations. Since its creation in 1963, the World Jurist Association has included and expressed a genuine concern about energy transition and climate change in all its World Law Congress. It is well known that as a result of the global rise of fuels in 2021 and the invasion of Ukraine, the global energy crisis has unleashed devastating consequences on the economy and human rights. Bearing this in mind, the World Jurist Association decided to constitute a permanent forum named Energy Transition and Climate in order to address properly the situation that affects this sector. For the last 6 months, this forum has discussed about the gasification of Europe, the new and old challenges of energy market, and an approach to energy market from the rule of law. Supreme Court judges, commissioners, presidents of energy companies, members of parliament, and global activists from all over the world have gathered in these opening sessions to discuss, tackle, and propose solutions to the global energy crisis and all its consequences. All these discussions will be part of the live New York World Law Congress 2023 that will take place on July 20 and 21st, and that will be hosted at least during the second day at the iconic General Assembly of the United Nations. Today, the World Jurist Association, the London School of Economics, Climate Policy Radar, and Laws.African joint efforts to continue this conversation under the title of Digital Resources for Climate Change. UK Judge Lord Robert Carnwath, founder of Law.Africa Grantham, visiting fellow of London School of Economics, and founder of Climate Policy Radar, Nachmany, the director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University and researcher of the London School of Economics, Higham, will continue with this ongoing dialogue on these subjects. Now I pass the floor to Lord Robert Carnwath, please.
Thank you very much, Diego. My name is Robert Carnwath. I'm in London. I'm a former Justice of our UK Supreme Court, and I've been involved in a number of activities connected with environment, and particularly climate change. And I'm also a visiting professor in practice at the Grantham Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the LSE. And I'm honored to be chairing and introducing this session. The general theme is, as the title says, digital resources for climate law. And we are very much conscious that around the world, a number of agencies have been improving and preparing digital databases of climate laws and cases. And a lot of work has been done, and you'll be hearing about it from our speakers. But one of the challenges is, having made those databases and having sort of developed them, is actually making them available to people in a sort of practical way. And we'll be looking at how that can be done. And we were looking at the practical consequences. The format of this afternoon is going to be, or whatever it is, wherever you are, afternoon in London, we have 4 speakers, and they'll each be speaking between 7 and 10 minutes. And then we'll have an opportunity for questions, and there's a Q&A function, I think, at the bottom of your screens. I should say that our first speaker is not going to be with us for the whole afternoon, so we'll probably deal with questions and answers for him. That's Professor Michael Gerrard. But the others we'll deal with at the end of the session. And the aim is to complete the session after about 75 minutes, or perhaps a bit longer, depending on how the discussion is going. So without more ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Michael Gerrard from the United States. And he has, for a number of years, been the director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University, and the leader of the Climate Change Litigation Database. And as you probably know, they are perhaps one of the most experienced organizations in recording in digital form the cases and law on climate change. So I'll hand over then to Michael and we'll listen to with interest to what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Lord Carnwath. It's a pleasure to be with all of you virtually. Let me share my screen. Can you see that? So our center at Columbia Law School has a number of databases. We actually have 8 databases, and I'm going to just say a word about each of them and then talk in a little bit more detail about 1 or 2 of them. Our most prominent database is our collection of climate change litigation around the world. We attempt to have all of the cases on climate change in any country in the world. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The next is the Climate Re-Regulation Tracker. When President Trump took office in 2017, he immediately set about trying to deregulate, to rescind or weaken many of the US regulations on climate change. When President Biden took office 4 years later, he began to reverse course. And so while we were initially tracking the efforts by the Trump administration to deregulate, we are now tracking efforts by the Biden administration to re-regulate. The next database is based on a book that Professor John Dernbach and I co-edited called Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization in the United States. It has more than 1,000 recommendations for changes in federal and state and local law to decarbonize the economy. Growing out of that, we have our Model Laws project. We've recruited more than 24 law firms, all working pro bono to draft model laws to implement the recommendations of the book. And we have a website that posts not only those that our team has drafted, but also a large number of model laws from others and existing laws and also related resources. The Climate Attribution Database is a database of scientific studies that analyze and document the relationship between climate change and certain physical impacts. Looking at the ways that physical impacts, that extreme storms and so forth, can be attributed to greenhouse gases. And this is an issue that would be very relevant in litigation, so we've created this database. The Silencing Science Tracker grew out of the efforts not only by the Trump administration, but by others to try to suppress climate science or to deny climate science. And so we have tracked the various efforts by different entities to try to do that as a way of fighting back against that. This is a project we do jointly with the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, which provides pro bono legal help to climate scientists who are being attacked or harassed in various ways. We know that one essential element of reducing the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is not only slashing the emissions, but also trying to remove a great deal of carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere. Our carbon dioxide removal database goes through, it is basically a large annotated bibliography of the legal literature that exists on carbon dioxide removal. New York City and New York State both have important laws on climate change with many deadlines and many requirements. So we've set up 2 databases, one for New York State, one for New York City, to track the implementation of these laws and to post all the relevant documents. For many of these databases, we've established mailing lists for updates. Some of them are monthly, some of them are less often than monthly. All of this is free. Anyone who is interested can go on the database on the website of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law and subscribe to any of these databases. So let me now focus on the climate change litigation databases that we have. And we divided it between the US and the rest of the world. So if we go to the database for every country other than the US, you see that we've categorized all the cases under these categories. And one can also search by jurisdiction. So you see we have one or more cases from each of these countries. And so if we go to Argentina, for example, you see we have found 10 climate change cases in Argentina. And if we go to the first one, you'll see a summary of the case and then links to the documents. So here's the decision in the original Spanish in that case. Mikhail will be talking about efforts that we're making to try to improve the functionality of this. Can you still see my slides? So the next database that I'll mention is our model laws for deep decarbonization in the United States database. And so we've divided.
Michael, I think we're having problems. I'm having problems seeing your slides. I don't know whether they've moved on.
Can others see my slides?
We can see your slides, Mike, but we couldn't see you doing a demo on the database.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, well, I'll just continue to talk because I only have a couple of minutes left. So the model laws for deep decarbonization database. Okay, so can you see it now? Can you see the database now, or just the? Let me do one more thing here. I'm sorry. How is that?
Well, I can just see the model laws for deep decarbonization and climate regulation tracker, but I can't see the actual database.
Okay, so I'll just describe. We've divided up the topics, the various pathways into 8 topics: cross-cutting approaches, energy efficiency, conservation, electricity decarbonization, fuel decarbonization, and so forth. And for each of those, we have subcategories such as utility scale solar. And for each of those, we then in turn have a collection of all of the databases, of all of the information that we have compiled for those subject matters. For the climate deregulation tracker, we have very brief summaries of each of the new regulations and links to the actual text of the regulation or the proposal or the notice of hearing or whatever it is. Then for the New York State climate law tracker, we list all the deadlines that are required, that are involved. We indicate whether the deadline has been met, whether it has been exceeded, what's going on. We link to the various relevant documents. So let me stop sharing and just say that in terms of the use of these databases, we've found that particularly our global database of climate litigation is in use by lawyers and judges and scholars and students all around the world. And we like to think that this has advanced the overall effort of climate litigation, since everyone working on it has immediate free access to all the cases around the world. And we look forward to working with Mikhail's group. We already work with Catherine's group at LSE to enhance the utility and functionality of these databases. So that's my presentation.
Well, thank you, Michael, very much. That's very clear. I'm sorry about some of the slides, but I mean, while we've still got you here, how long have you been doing this? It's quite a few years that you've been, I recall.
We started the litigation database in 2007 as a way of updating the first edition of my book, Global Climate Change in U.S. Law. And then in 2011, we added the non-U.S. cases, started adding the non-U.S. cases.
Yes. And how have you managed to sort of keep up? Because there's been, when you started, there were relatively few cases, and it's sort of expanded beyond measure, hasn't it?
It's much easier to track all the U.S. cases because there are databases up for the non-U.S. Cases. It's more challenging. We've recently brought on a lawyer, Maria Antonia Tigre, to work on that, and she has assembled a group of about 70 rapporteurs in countries around the world to help us keep track of it. It's challenging for the cases that are not in English, especially challenging for the cases that are in different alphabets. But with the help of these rapporteurs around the world, we've managed to gather a very large number of cases, and we are continuing to do that. And let me just say that anyone who is watching this video, if there are cases that you are aware of in your country that are not on our database, please email me. We would love to include them on the database.
Thank you. Now, I don't see any questions yet in the Q&A. I don't know whether, do any of our other speakers want to ask Michael anything while you've got him here?
I will ask you a question, Mike. Sorry, Greg.
Sure.
Yeah. And I'm setting this up for my talk, which is next. What are the main challenges that you have when aggregating and analyzing these cases?
One of the issues we have is what do we include? Because there are many cases that may be motivated by the desire to fight climate change, such as fighting a coal-fired power plant, but don't necessarily have climate theories. So we've decided to include only those that are explicitly about climate change, where climate change is an important issue explicitly in the case, and not those that are motivated by that, but don't have that reason. Another challenge, of course, is that in many countries, there are not computerized system to post all the cases. It's more challenging to get the cases, and that's one reason we would rely on our rapporteurs, but also on lawyers and scholars around the world to send us those cases as they arise.
Thank you. Well, I think at that point we might move on.
Did I see Greg raising his hand?
If I can,
Greg, sorry, do you?
Thank you, no problem. Thanks. It'll be quick. Similar to Michael, setting up for my presentation as well. Michael, can you give an indication of what is your coverage of African cases, given both the disproportional impact of climate change on Africa and developing countries, as well as the difficulty of sourcing cases from across Africa?
We do have a number of cases from Africa, but we think that we're missing some, and we would love to see. We would love to see more. We'd love to have your help and the help of others in making sure that we capture them all.
Right. Well, Michael, thank you very much indeed. Stay around as long as you can, but we'll keep in touch, and I think there'll be a lot of connection made out of this. Very helpful. Now we then move on, I think, to Mikhail Nachmany, who's the who's in London, I think, and is director, is CEO and founder of Climate Policy Radar, and also a visiting fellow at the Grantham Research Institute of the London School of Economics. And Mikhail, you're going to tell us something about the role, I think, of Climate Policy Radar, which sounds very interesting indeed. So over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, especially that every single face on the screen now is a collaborator of Climate Policy Radar, and it is really wonderful to be in such a great company. For about a decade, I did the role that Kate, who will speak later in the panel, is doing today, which is managing the climate change laws of the world legislation and policy database at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE. And we were motivated at the time by bringing this to parliamentarians who wanted to legislate better, hold their governments, do government oversight, pass budgets, and really wanted to share knowledge. That was the motivation of starting that database. And we created a big database of all the climate laws and policies in 200 national governments. And there's about 250,000 annual users on that database today. And Kate has been managing it for the last 2 years. She's probably doing a much better job than I did at the time. And I was getting impatient. And the reason I was getting impatient is because there are so many incredible technological developments today that enable us to order a vegan hamburger from a shop near us, or find a relative that we didn't even know that existed, through an increasing ability to take big chunks of data, read them, analyze them automatically, and connect them to each other in a meaningful way. And we still cannot Google climate policies in sub-Saharan Africa, or tell me what are the most interesting ways to deal with the right of standing in cases about human rights in Southeast Asia. The ability to do that meaningfully means that so many people who are busy advancing climate action through the law are unable to make sufficient progress, because usually they're limited, their resources are limited. Often these are non-governmental organizations, lawyers who are working pro bono, policymakers in resource-constrained countries, and academics who really don't have the time and the money to invest in expensive subscriptions, sometimes to commercially available software that will provide them with that. So that is the background to founding Climate Policy Radar. And I'll now share my screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see my screen. Can you? Yes, great. And Climate Policy Radar aims to marry the rich knowledge base that has been created over a decade at the Grantham Research Institute, at the Sabin Center, and in many other places in the world, and arm them with artificial intelligence and natural language processing capabilities that will allow us to do everything that we do better and faster and deeper, and therefore hopefully enable better climate action. So we're on this mission to map and analyze the global climate policy and litigation landscape, so we can support evidence-based decision-making, both by policymakers, by lawyers, by researchers, by civil society. So we are building a knowledge base for climate policy law litigation by harnessing technology. And in that, saving times, breaking data silos, because often when you have time to only look at 20 documents, or it's 3 countries, or only to do something in the language that you understand, you're by definition not looking at a wider range of sources and resources that would make your arguments richer, that would make your research deeper, and so on. So what we do happens in 3 parts. We bring in a lot of documents. Usually those documents have been carefully curated by others. So by Mike's team at the Sabin Center, by Kate's team at LSE, by UN Disaster Risk and Reduction at the Prevention Web database, by Jackie Peel's team in Australia. There are so many databases that have already done this work. But what we do is we move them from being static PDFs that you need to open and press Control Find in order to actually find what you're looking for, and actually allow a deep dive into them by digesting and analyze them, and then exposing those so users can actually see them in a meaningful way. There is no better way of explaining this than demonstrating it. And I'll demonstrate it by showing you the open tool that we have already published. The link to it is on my last slide, and somebody could probably put it in the chat. I'm sure some of you already know it. It is open, it is free, and it includes all of the laws and the policies from climate change laws of the world, from the LSE legislation and policy database. In the demo here, I've typed in a search term, solar cooking. I want to know how solar cooking is addressed in legislation and in policy strategies, action plans globally. What I get is a list of results. Those results are not only from the title of the law or the plan, they're also from the full text of the document. So if I click on the national energy policy from Tanzania, I will see on the left-hand side a set of passages from the text itself, and clicking on them will take me to the actual page in the PDF and highlight the paragraph so I could very, very quickly find what I want. This is the first step in what we're doing. The next step will be to automatically analyze and put some structure on this. So show me everything about renewables. Let's drill down into solar. Let's drill down into PV. Let's drill down into a certain size of PV, and the ability to find those nuggets of text and to put them to pull them out of the documents and to put them together in a meaningful way goes a long way towards making research much more efficient. It also means that things that are buried on page 238 of a document are easily more accessible. And sometimes this is where exactly the nuggets that we're looking for in our research are hidden. For every document or for every law, we have a summary, though that was manually written by researchers of the LSE, and we have some data that allows you to understand the context of this document. And for every country, there is a country page that allows you to look at the legislation, the policies, and here's a preview at the litigation cases, because the next step for us is bringing in all of Mike's excellent work on litigation. Mike and the team at the Sabin Center, of course, with Michael Berger and Maria Antonio and many others who are doing this fantastic work, bringing them in so we could do the same thing, so we could search in the full text of the documents. Our roadmap is really building up on all of those things that I've said. We're going to bring in more documents and more document types. One of the things that we're going to be bringing in, for example, are all of the submissions that countries submit to the UN climate agreement under the Paris Agreement. So we could analyze countries' commitments, see how they translate into law and policy, for example. We will build stronger analytical tools, and we will continue building our partnerships that are with the most interesting and exciting and the kind of thought leaders and forefront of research, both on law, policy, and litigation, so we can bring those resources to users. And this opportunity to speak with you today is obviously part of that. And I've just said all of those things. One of the interesting things that happens is that one of the ways to bring knowledge to users is not to reinvent the wheel. By not reinventing the wheel, we work through existing channels that already have proven to be credible. For example, LSE's Climate Change Laws of the World and the Sabin Center's climate case charts every year already draw almost 500,000 users, policymakers, lawyers, researchers, by providing the technology for those databases and replacing the static libraries of PDFs, and enabling those that extra layer of analytical tools on top of that, we are already bringing those to the new users. And that is something that is going to happen very soon, within a matter of weeks, laws and policies, and within a matter of hopefully a small number of months, litigation documents as well. This is a preview to what Climate Change Laws of the World powered by Climate Policy Radar will look like. Anyone who knows this database already will recognize its kind of look and feel. But when you type something into here, you will get a very, very similar experience to the one that I just demonstrated, being able to dive into the passages of the full text. My two last slides are a peek into the future. So the beauty with artificial intelligence is that, and the explosion of developments in it are represented a lot by the advances in automatic translation. So when we pull out the text from the PDFs so we can search the full text, we are already automatically detecting the language and translating it to English if it wasn't in English in the first place. So look at this example from a Bulgarian law. Somebody searched for energy prices. The term was in Bulgarian in the law on page 23. If we click on that, that will bring us to the right place in the Bulgarian document, and we'll be able to toggle between seeing the original language and the translation. These are mock-ups. This is a few months away from being in the product. I'll say months, so if it's in weeks, that will be a good surprise for anyone using it. But we're very, very close to achieve that. And the second and last peek into the future is AI-generated text. This is a screen grab that I took off Twitter from about 12 hours ago. OpenAI, a leading kind of natural language processing company, has just released its model that allows asking a question to the computer and the computer to generate text. If you look at the quality of the text, and this is a computer-generated text only responding to this question with no human intervention, you can see the quality of this. This has been deemed by experts as something that, as text that an undergrad student would have received a distinction for in this specific field. So the ability to use this kind of emerging technology into enabling a quick search and a quick find of some of our answers, not to replace humans, but just to help them a little bit in getting to the right resources and to help them save time, is something that we are very looking forward to experimenting with. We're open data and open source, so there's a strong justice element to our work by shrinking information asymmetries and providing those resources to those who can least pay for it. But also it means that there's a springboard for innovation. Anybody can take the data, anybody can take the code and build on it, whatever applications they seem applicable, they deem applicable and relevant. And by opening our data, we also open ourselves to correcting biases. There's a clear risk for biases when we start with natural language processing. By opening up the black box, we're opening ourselves to scrutiny and therefore hopefully reducing the risk of bias. Thank you. app.climatepolicyradar.org, have a try, and we'll be very, very happy to speak to any of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michal. That was a very clear introduction to that subject. It sounds fascinating. We maybe have time to come back to some points later on, but I think we better move on now to our next speaker, who is Greg Kempe from South Africa, and he is the Chief Technical Officer and co-founder of Laws Africa. And I think he's going to tell us about some of the problems of translating this sort of digital expertise to the African scene, which is slightly different to New York and London, I suspect. Greg, over to you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it is different. It is challenging. So I'm going to share my screen. And let's check, can everyone see my slides there? Great. So as you say, I lead Laws.Africa. We're a non-profit organization based in Cape Town in South Africa. Although today I'm talking to you from Abidjan in Ivory Coast on the west coast of Africa, as we are talking to the participants here about how we can improve access to West African legal resources as well. So as I mentioned earlier, climate change will disproportionately impact Africa and other developing nations. And one of our projects is to develop what we call the Open African Law Index, where we track public free access, government-provided free access to legal information in Africa. And in this chart, higher is better on the left. Kenya does an incredible job of providing free access to law. They actually get bonus points because they provide it in a machine-readable format. But you can see how the bulk of countries do very poorly. And I highlight this not to criticize those countries or critique them, but to highlight the challenge that this presents to business, to climate change advocates, to governments and the judicial sector in terms of supporting climate change policy and regulation in Africa. So this occurs generally at the local level, the national level, and even the regional level. So there are a number of regional African economic communities in Africa, and even those resources are limited. So the impact of this is that many African governments are quite limited in terms of their ability to access their own law. They must effectively buy or license that law back from private parties. And this is because they lack their own capacity to publish legal information, both legislation as well as case law, as well as judgments. They often also lack archives. So even if they have the capacity now to put this information online, they generally lack physical or even digital archives of their legislation and case law going back more than, say, 5 or 10 years. In some cases, there is no archive at all. This, as I'm sure you can understand, it really has huge negative impacts on the efficiency of the civil service, and it can really hamper advocacy and strategic litigation around critical issues such as climate change. As the previous speakers have mentioned, having access to this information is the first step, and if we don't have access to it, then it's really difficult to make do any research on it. And I'm sure it doesn't need to be said that if you don't know what the law says, you can't advocate for change and you can't use that law strategically. So our approach to providing access to this information as we work with governments to do it is there are a few layered foundations that we need to go through to ensure effective use of this information. If we start at the bottom, this legal information must first exist. It needs to be available to me. And that means if it's sitting in a research library or if it's sitting in a dusty archive, it's effectively not useful to me at all. So it must be digitized. I then need to know about it. As Michal has said, is if you're searching on a website and it can't find that law, it effectively doesn't exist to you. So making sure there's awareness and knowing that these repositories exist is essential. And only then when I can get access to that information, can I start applying it in my context. I need to be able to understand it. I need to be able to link it to other related legislation. Michal pointed out there the challenge of languages when it comes to working with this information. If I'm a climate advocate in an African country that English isn't my first language, but my laws are published in English, I have trouble understanding what my law says. And technology can really help that. Hopefully then once there's understanding, there's effective use and impact with this information. So our process, our goal is to enable public's access to this legal information in Africa through government ownership. So we don't want to own this information. Instead, our approach is we help African governments recapacitate themselves to publish their own legal information for free, for public access. So it's a whole process of digitization. It's a process also of changing how this information is published to make sure that new technology, as we said, everyone has, or very many people have access to mobile phones. So can we use mobile phones and make sure there's access to this information, even in rural areas where this technology or access is expensive? How can we improve access to this information? We also offer peer support and regional collaboration. We work across a number of countries in Africa, and the challenges are often very similar. And by bringing together, say, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda, they can work together to help solve regional access to information, because they will be impacted in similar ways to climate change. And they should be able to work together to perform their own advocacy and changes in legislation. Together with our partner, the African Legal Information Institute, AfricanLe, we have a presence in over 15 African countries at the moment. Some of these are not quite as rich access as we would like. You can see Cote d'Ivoire there is not green. That's why I'm here at the moment, trying to improve access to this information. This is all part of a larger movement called the Free Access to Law movement, which is worldwide. And we really work hard in promoting the free access to law principles in Africa. And Michal also spoke about how important the digitization aspect of this is, right? If I've got a 500-page PDF document that I'm trying to read on my phone that isn't in a language I understand, it's really difficult for me to work with that effectively. So our process is to leapfrog Africa into a really modern era where we can use technology to improve the efficiency and the cost effectiveness of making this information available. If it's going to be available for free, government knows that it has to be put online cost effectively and efficiently. This slide that we're looking at now shows an example of what is possible when we have digitized legislation. So in this case, section 170 of the South African Constitution has been amended. And the user can click on a button on the side that says, well, what changed? And they can be presented with an automatically generated comparison of what the differences are here. And this is just a small example of what technology can allow us to do. All the work that Michal is doing in terms of automatic translation, in terms of applying machine learning to finding this information, this makes it so much easier to apply those techniques and technology because they don't have to start off with PDF documents. Instead, they can start off with documents where the structure and the content the machine can really understand to provide improved access, to provide a rich reading experience to help users make sense of this, applying machine translation where necessary. And it really means we can use technology to just create a greater degree of access, especially into rural areas, but also into so many aspects of the economy to make use of this information. Over the last 3 years, especially during COVID, the growth in use of this information has been incredible. We have 3 million users a year, and it's growing at almost three times that rate over the year, over each year. And so the demand for this is really, really clear. And the more we put this information online, the more use there is for it, and the more opportunities arise out of it. And I think Michal mentioned that we're all partners on this call, and I cannot emphasize that enough, that the success here is driven by partnerships. Partnerships from this funding side are, by our calculations, for every dollar or euro that is invested in free access to legal information in Africa, is about $1,000 return in terms of free, effective access to support government administration processes. It supports business, it supports anti-corruption measures, it obviously supports environmental legislation and climate change advocacy. So it's an enormous, for a funder, it's an enormous investment opportunity. And on the other side of it is doing what organizations like the Climate Policy Radar is doing, where they take this raw information, because that's what we really care about, is putting out the raw base information, and then others doing their work on top of that, so that they don't have to find this information to digitize it, so that we can help others build up databases and help policymakers then dig through that information and find what they need. So yeah, we openly license our content. We're really keen to find partners to work with this information, because having impact means we can keep doing the work, and it leads to the change that we want to see. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Greg. That was a number of questions we'll come back to on that, which I think is very, very interesting indeed. But meanwhile, we'll move to our last speaker, who is Catherine Higham, coordinator of the project Climate Change Laws of the World at the Grantham Research Institute of the LSE, and she will tell us about their work. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Robert, and to Michal and to Greg for really interesting and exciting presentations on what the future is going to look like for all of us, as well as to Professor Gerrard, and I see that he's already had to leave the call, unfortunately. I have the privilege of going last today, which means that I didn't prepare any slides because I wanted to be able to riff off what was being presented by the other panelists. And I thought I would talk about three things when I was preparing my talk for the day. So the first was to introduce the Climate Change Laws of the World project. Michal has already really done that, and particularly she's introduced the core element of the Climate Change Laws of the World project, which has been a decade-long endeavour to document climate change legislation and policy from countries all over the world, so that the global climate movement, researchers, politicians, legislators, judges have access to that information and know what's going on. But we also do another piece of work at the Grantham Institute towards this project, which is to do our own research and our own analysis of this data to really try and understand what is happening and to enable others to understand what is happening around the world and how they can use that data. We do this both for legislation and policy, and also collaborating with the Sabin Centre for litigation, for cases that are using climate laws in practice. So I'm going to focus, instead of talking about the database and that side of the project, I'm going to focus a little bit on the research that we do. And I'm going to talk about two things there. I'm firstly going to talk about why it's important to have global aggregated data on climate law, whether that's legislation, whether that's policy, or whether that's litigation. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why we actually also really need to be able to get in deep and understand what is happening in individual pieces of legislation, what is happening in individual court cases. And I'm going to focus, when I'm talking about this, on sort of practical application of the work that Greg and Michal and Mike have been talking about here. So how can we actually use this to generate knowledge and insight as well as data? So if we think about this question of why do we need to aggregate information that is relevant to climate change at the global level? I think there's kind of two really key problems that we're trying to address here. There are commercial databases that track laws and policies, but typically only for a single country, and you need to be a trained lawyer with some kind of paid access to use those resources. So if I'm a lawyer in Ecuador trying to use, maybe the databases I do have paid access to understand climate change law, I'm going to be really limited to understanding what's happened in the national context. And I'm not going to be able to understand that in another context that has real parallels to my context, something new and innovative has happened that I could actually be trying to rely on to give me inspiration, or even as a legal authority potentially. So that's one problem. And the second problem is that not every country even has that degree of access to these kinds of commercial databases. And Greg has just illustrated that for us really, really well in the African context. And without global tools, not only can we not do our work as lawyers and legal professionals to kind of understand what precedents might exist, what authorities are relevant to us, we also can't understand the impact that work on climate change by legal professionals is having. We can only do that if we aggregate. So I've been working on a paper recently with colleagues at the Grantham Research Institute who are all econometricians. And we've been trying to understand what is the impact of filing a climate change case against a corporation. Does it have an impact on that corporation's share price? That's a question that is, turns out, very hard to answer, even if you have 3 brilliant econometricians working with you. But the first major challenge in answering it is, well, how do we know what cases have been filed against corporations? And it has only been with the use of the Sabin Centre's climate case chart, the climate databases that Mike was talking about, and with many, many hours actually of time from myself and from research assistants passing through that data and developing a smaller database of all of the cases against corporations, and then identifying every corporation mentioned in every single case, that we have been able to put together a data set that can even help us to start answering that kind of question. So that, I think, answers the sort of first point of why we need these kinds of global aggregators on issues like climate change that are so new in some ways. I mean, obviously climate change is not new, but which present so many novel questions and which do so at a global scale. We also, though, we need to be able to dig into individual documents in order to be able to do legal research that has a real impact on our collective future. And I'll illustrate that with two more examples. The first is an example that I literally was using just today. I have been doing some work on the issue of carbon dioxide removals, which Mike has already highlighted as a really important question in the climate space. And I wanted to understand what legislation was in place to govern carbon dioxide removals in different countries. And I searched for the term carbon dioxide removals and the associated term of greenhouse gas removals in the old version of the Climate Change Laws of the World database, the not AI-powered version. And I came up with a few hits, but I didn't come up with some of the laws that I already knew about that I knew were really innovative, including a law from the Bahamas that is setting up a system for governing ocean-based carbon dioxide removals and allowing those to be integrated into global carbon markets in a way that nonetheless is kind of safe and responsible. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm not getting results that I know exist, so I must be only getting a really partial picture. I then went to the prototype of the Climate Change Laws of the World database powered by the CPR architecture. And the second hit was that law from the Bahamas that I knew I wanted to look at, as well as a number of other pieces of legislation that were really interesting and exciting to me. So that, I think, is another example of how the work that Greg and Michal have been talking about on the digitization of legal information and the provision of that information for free to our global legal community is really important. And then to give a final example, if I may, thinking about litigation cases, I was recently working on a project trying to understand how governments have been sued by their citizens when citizens feel that the government's action on climate change is falling short of what is required to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and to keep us within a safe warming limit. And there, one of the really important questions is how many cases are looking at questions around the 1.5 degree temperature target that was stated in the Paris Agreement and reaffirmed in the Glasgow Climate Pact at COP26. To do that, to find out what cases were saying about that 1.5 degree targets and how many of them there were, took absolutely hours from a research assistant at the Grantham Institute who had to read through like thousands of pages of case documents to try and understand where this issue was coming up. And that, again, is something that with these new tools, with these new digital resources, we're going to be able to do much, much faster. So I hope I've covered a little bit about really the use case for what we've been talking about and why it's so important that as a legal community, as a global legal community, we are investing in these kinds of resources, both in terms of time and money, but also in terms of making sure that legal professionals are educated about what machine learning is, how you can use it in your research, what some of the ongoing drawbacks are, like the biases that Michal was talking about, and why I think this is such an important issue for organizations like the World Law Foundation to be getting involved in. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was very, very interesting and useful overview. We've got, there's a question actually, might be relevant to you. Question came in, talking about Asian countries, such as India and China, which have quite a lot of pollution problems. And it's the question asked, do the world databases include Asian countries' laws as well? What's the position there with sort of, well, Asian countries generally, and also China in particular?
So the answer to that is that we do include laws and policies from Asian countries in the Climate Change Laws of the World database. And for China in particular, we not only include sort of pieces of legislation directly geared towards climate change or exclusively geared towards climate change, we also include a number of foundational documents that set out what the Chinese state strategy is going to be to tackle the joint questions of development and climate change. So that includes the 5-year plans, which are really important overarching strategic documents that do in practice guide what is happening in China and how governments at every level are thinking of their priorities. So we do have that information. One of the things that we hope the database enables people to do is to see where there are gaps in what's being done by different countries from around the world, whether or not they have adequate legislation and policy on particular issues, and what that might look like, as well as drawing inspiration from what countries in parallel situations are doing. So where action is happening, and there is a lot of action happening in both China and India on climate change at the moment, so obviously globally we're nowhere near where we need to be, but I think we need to recognize that really advances are being made. So where that action happens, we track it, and we also hope that that highlights where there are still big gaps.
Thank you. Do you want to comment on that, Michal, at all?
Yes, please, just very quickly. Many of the world's largest emitters are actually federal countries. And one of the blind spots that we currently have is with the subnational or the state level tracking of policy and legislation in those big federal countries. US, Canada, Australia, China, India, Mexico, Brazil, all of those have state level legislation as well. And currently that's a huge blind spot for all of us, where there's of course local efforts to track these things, but the ability to see, and then hopefully not just to aggregate and to track progress, but also to learn from each other's prototyping of approaches to decarbonization and to increased resilience is something that would open up dramatically the ability to do things better. One of the advantages of taking superpowering our collection and analysis approaches with technology is the ability to potentially start scraping laws and policies from the subnational level. There's about 600 subnational governments in the world if we counted all the federal governments combined. And the ability to do that is something that we're hoping to get into within a year or two, so we can start closing that gap as well.
Good, thank you. Right, well, I think that deals with that particular question. I'd like to come back to Greg, if he's there. Yes, there he is. Greg, I was very interested by what your view from Africa. It so happens that I was earlier this year in September, I was in Ghana for the Commonwealth Judges Conference, and we were talking about the question of access to justice, but bringing access to actually communities, because a lot of these communities, individuals, don't have the digital resources to get access. Now, I imagine Ghana's probably scores quite well. I didn't see it on your list, but how do you deal with the problem of actually getting digital resources to communities who may not have much access to that sort of thing?
Thank you. That's a really good question. And actually, I was in Ghana earlier this week on exactly this work. Ghana, unfortunately, is struggling at the moment, so they don't rank particularly highly, but they are very interested in seeing what they can do. In terms of reaching the regional communities, it's often about intermediaries. So it can be organizations that support particular subject areas. So it might be women's rights or small business rights or women and children. And, they need to be empowered with this information before they can actually do their work effectively. So it improves the efficiency. So once this information is online, those organizations can then be taught how to use these resources, or just curated packs of this information can be prepared for those sorts of organizations that target a specific subject area, so that when those members are in the field and they're working in rural or remote communities, they have at their fingertips the raw legal information they need, as well as possibly interpreted information, maybe guides that are translated into the local vernacular, the local language, to help bring that information to a regional area. We were in Dakar earlier this year, and they have a system of maison de justice, which are effectively local resource centers to bring the law and bring that information into rural areas. So it's, as I said, there's these series of layers, and at the very beginning, we have to start off with it must exist and it must be available. And then we can start building interventions on top of that. But if we don't have the foundational information, then those interventions are doomed to failure or are short-lived.
Yes. Thank you. I don't know, I mean, it's quite interesting hearing the three of you actually talking about the subject from different perspectives. I mean, Greg, if you were talking to Michal about her very interesting project, what would you ask her to do that would help you more? I mean, can you have that sort of discussion? I'd be interested to hear what you would say to her.
I'm really curious to hear Michal's answer after this as well. That's a great question, because we've been chatting in the chat here. What I loved about meeting Michal is they're doing the work on top of this information, like the hard work of taking it and then really providing great subject area access and building tools on top of it. Whereas a lot of our time is spent working with governments to convince them that this should be done, that this information should be publicly available, and showing them how to do it, and then working with them to actually make it available. That we rarely get beyond the making it available stage. So we're not building a lot of the really great tooling on top of that. So, you know, when we met Michal, I think there's such an opportunity there to go to funders, say to funders, help us find basic access to information, because look what it unlocks. Right? Look at the value that it creates. And as I say, these partnerships are an essential part of this. It's the only way we can do it is to work together, because these problems are just transnational. They are enormous, and we can't solve them on our own. So we have to work together.
Yeah. Michal, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Yes. Thanks, Greg, for the warm words. I mean, I'm so in love with Greg's project that it's really beautiful, because I mean, there's so many layers to this. And I think, Greg, you even had a slide for the layers. But, you know, I'm a founder of an AI company after being an academic for many years. And the first question that people kind of say, but how do you actually know what's going on? How do you replace this human knowledge and human intuition that's been collected for so many years? And the answer is we're not. And what we have to do is constantly pad whatever we're doing with a combination of helping the humans do stuff better. And a collaboration between us and Laws.Africa, for example, takes advantage of a regional localized knowledge with relationships that can only happen when you speak to people, and that can only happen when Greg goes into the room with the Côte d'Ivoire government and says, can you please, get your act together so the laws will be available, so we can search them, so we can provide greater access to justice. And only that we have something to work with, because until then we will send people to libraries to scan copies of badly formatted documents. And the ability then to take that knowledge and bring it back, and I'm so hopeful that we will be able to feed that back into local communities in those relationships that that Laws.Africa, Greg and Maria and team are forming, and to actually bring those back, that very highly curated and deeply analyzed knowledge and insights that Kate and Mike Gerrard and others and all the research teams will do. We're such a rich ecosystem that really cannot operate with each other. So I see so many synergies between us, and the fact that we're all not for profit and all open source, and all of our stuff is available for free, speaks to the giant need to provide public goods in this space. This is, access to legal resources is a basic human right here, and all of us are really working to that effect, I think. And it's great to be in the room with all of you.
Does Kate want to add anything to that?
Only to say that I share Greg and Michal's excitement. We have many laws and policies from African countries in the database at the moment. But as Mike Gerrard was saying, both in terms of legislation and in terms of litigation, there are so many things that we don't know that mean that all our attempts to understand what's happening at a global level are partial. And I think that's a really massive problem, and one that we acknowledge everywhere, but still, kind of with the resources that we currently have, are unable to get past. So I think these kinds of opportunities lend us really sort of the potential to do a lot that is very powerful, much more easily than we have been able to do it in the past, which is just very exciting.
Yeah, thank you. Michal, you want to come back to you?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add one thing. You know, we're in with the World Law Foundation and the World Jurist Association, and we tend to have some view of what that means and what kind of legal activity is informed by that. And you know, I immediately think about changing laws and taking governments to courts and taking corporates to courts, but actually, there's quite a lot of benign activity that lawyers contribute to, like supporting investments and like facilitating trade, and that underpins our ability to transition into a low carbon and resilient world. And within that, understanding the regulatory landscape and the policy risks and the litigation risks that come with that transition is critical. And the ability to identify where more areas need attention, and therefore more policy and legal work in order to create enabling situations and enabling conditions for greater investment, for example, in renewables, is critical. So understanding that is not only to take governments to court or corporations to court, but also in order to create those enabling environments. We saw Vietnam doubling its renewables or deploying a huge amount of renewables. Why? Because they put together a regulatory framework that allowed that. How do we work together, private sector, public sector, government, in order to facilitate that? Can only happen when we understand what works. And we only understand what works when we know what's out there.
Thank you. I see there's a question that's been asked. Have you faced any copyright issues when uploading information onto your databases? Is copyright an issue? Does anyone want to comment on that?
I'm happy to come in and talk about that, since it's often raised. We're fairly lucky that in most African countries that we've worked with, the copyright acts are generally quite explicit about saying that information, in particular, like laws and judgments produced by the state, there is no copyright in them. However, that's the primary legal information. So secondary information, say law reports or commentary or guides, there sometimes is a copyright that lies in that. This, you know, while maybe the law says this, we do sometimes have challenges that governments feel that they need to recoup the costs. And they're saying, but this is our intellectual property that we're putting out, we should be charging for access. So we do often have to go through an education campaign in terms of helping them understand, you know, what copyright does apply or what doesn't apply. The other side of that, though, is I mentioned that a lot of commercial services provide obviously access to African legislation, sometimes completely, sometimes only in bits and pieces. So the challenge there is we can't use that information. So if a government has licensed back a consolidated, consolidated legislation from a third-party provider, they might not have the right to reuse that consolidated legislation and put it online. And that means for us to come in and assist a country with bringing up to date their legislation collection, we have to start from scratch. We have to go and find the original government gazette or original publication of these laws and put those online, because otherwise there is copyright infringement. And that's why we feel it's so important that governments are doing this themselves, because that removes the sort of cost of access barrier, right? That this can be freely available. It must be freely available to everyone, because it's a fundamental aspect of how our societies work.
Thank you. Do either of the others want to comment on that? Or add anything? No. We're coming to the end. I wonder, I mean, it's been a very interesting conversation. But the thing that strikes me, or two things I'd like to ask. One is, how do you keep this information up to date? How do you make sure it's accurate? Because it's obviously got, if it's going to be any use, it's got to be up to date and accurate. Perhaps Kate and Michal might just comment on that. Kate, do you want to?
Absolutely. So this is a major challenge for us. We try our best. We don't believe we are 100% exhaustive in terms of every climate law and policy ever passed. Firstly, because not all of these policies are made publicly available somewhere where we can link to that in the database. So that's one of the challenges. And then the other is time and resources, and the human challenge of finding all of the legislation that's going on. We try and address that by being smart about where we look. So one of our major sources of information is self-reported information in government's nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. A lot of the time, the government will say, we plan to do these things, and here is the here is the legislation, here are the policies under which we are going to do that. We also try and use as many other aggregators of information as we can, follow sort of relevant information. We spend a lot of time with research assistants going to the government websites of the Ministry of Environment in Burundi and seeing if there's anything new there. Yeah. So it is very complicated, and I would be delighted to hand over to Michal, who has a plan, you will be pleased to know, for how we are going to make it less hard work in the future, which is one of the reasons we're so delighted to be partnering with Climate Policy Radar, and why we see this sort of differentiation between research and sort of the provision of data kind of moving forwards in the future. So, Michal.
Great, thanks. So we will still have to rely on the humans, because sometimes they will have to go to the library and scan the document. We hope to make it easier for the humans to contribute data by giving them easy interfaces in order to upload and to have a broad reach to the people who are active in their communities and their legal communities, and the people online and the people watching this. Please, if you see a law or document or litigation case that we don't have, do email or send it to us, or bring it to our attention through multiple social media platforms that we're all on. So working with humans, both, let's call it crowdsourcing, but mainly expert sourcing. There are so many organizations who work on this. They work on this manually. They have researchers who are dedicated to this. The next frontier, of course, is automatically scraping or identifying what are those places that host government laws, policies, and court cases, recognizing that these are the places where we need to go to, and then sending something to go and grab it automatically for us. These things will be easier in some cases and much more difficult in other cases, and will involve, at least at the beginning, a heavy human intervention in identifying what are the relevant places. The California Ministry of Energy, I'm sure, will be one of the places that will be easier, because I'm sure they've put a lot of effort into making sure that everything is nice and structured. Potentially one of the constituencies that Greg is very busy with will be less structured, and it will be more complicated for us to find the information automatically. But moving in that direction and showing what is possible, and advocating for governments and courts to digitize is again part of that collaboration. We are very excited about the huge amount of databases that already exist, but we also know that if we relieve them of a lot of the manual effort that they do with tagging and so on, they might be able to support it, to divert those resources into the places that machines cannot, into the human relationships, into the crowdsourcing and so on.
Thank you. And I mean, Greg, do you want to add anything on that? Because yours is probably more of a problem area than some of the others.
It's actually a really great question. And the good answer is that the hard part is starting. The hard part is bringing things up to date. Once you've got an up-to-date collection of a country's legislation, keeping it up to date is actually relatively straightforward, because countries, at least for national acts, there's a limited number of national acts that are passed every year. Regulations are going to be a bit more, but the cost and the time it takes to now keep it up to date once you've got over that first hurdle is actually a lot more tractable. It's that initial stage, which is the tough part. Not to say that it's easy, but it's a bit more tractable. So I always say digitization is your first step towards being future-proof. Once you've got it in, you've taken that first step, the next steps become easier.
Good. Well, thank you for that. And how are you getting on in the Ivory Coast? Are they helping?
The Ivory Coast actually is very interesting. They're a civil law jurisdiction, and they're doing some really great stuff about making the information available, and we're talking to them about how we can improve their efficiency and make it publicly available. So there are definitely pockets of excellence, and we want to bring those together and help them to spread their knowledge and their expertise.
Well, best of luck with that. And I think at that point, we probably need to draw this to a close. Thank you all very much indeed for what has been an extraordinarily interesting discussion, and I hope the interaction will bear further fruit in the future. So thank you very much. But I'm going to hand over now to Diego, who's going to conclude the proceedings.
Well, thank you very much, all the speakers. It's been a very interesting and sometimes enthusiastic discussion. I think there's going to be a lot of grounds for collaboration. That's really within the purpose of the World Jurist Association. So thank you again. I just took some notes while you were speaking, so I'm going to try to wrap up a general overview of the discussion. Please feel free to interrupt me or to make any remarks or any comments. I mean, my headline of this conversation is collaboration of the global community is required to deal with the translational problems faced when trying to access policies, regulation, and case law on the climate change. And digital resources are going to be extremely helpful in this joint global effort. Identifying the law and case law is a key issue to help energy transition, and it will enable a change in climate regulation. Michael Gerrard, the director of the Sabin Center at the Columbia University, has pointed out that the change in the US climate, oh, sorry, someone is calling me, excuses. Not that, that the change in the US of the climate policy since the Biden administration has taken power has enabled them to create a new database. He pointed out that probably the most difficult issue when developing a database based on climate change is when actually the case law is relevant for climate change issues. Nachmany from Climate Policy Radar shared a very interesting example of its open source and free database. When he used a simple search of solar cooking, we were able to see the potential of your database and how it's impossible to get that through Google. He also pointed out how AI is going to be able to identify much better relevant information, and how automatic translation is going to help us a lot to understand what is being done in other languages and countries. And although we will not be replaced by AI, artificial intelligence is certainly going to help us a lot. Kempe, with his African approach from laws.africa, have developed a very interesting law index of different countries, led by Kenya. Is probably the best example in the continent. Many countries, as you pointed out, Greg, in Africa, have a lack of capacity in archives and digitalized case law, and it's very difficult for them to share information. So they need help. If you don't know the law, if you don't understand what the law says, it's very difficult to advocate for a change and to make people aware of the situation. If it is not accessible, it does not exist. So Catherine Higham of Climate Change Laws of the World has focused on the analysis of its database. She made very interesting remarks about the importance of aggregation of database and how the database you guys are developing have much benefits that the regular commercial database. No? So it's very important that you guys collaborate and that people help you, particularly with everybody who is listening. If there's any case that these guys have not identified on the database, please let them know. And as regards the question of Asia, that unfortunately is not represented here, the India and China are also included in your database. So that's basically my final remarks. Please feel free to make any comments or any corrections in my general overview. And if there's nothing else, thank you all very much. I look forward to seeing you in New York on July 21st at the General Assembly of the United Nations for the World Law Congress, and having a global conversation that will enable us to have a broader view on climate change issues with a wide variety of people and topics in person, not through technology. So thank you, everybody. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.